the most horrifying sexual mysteries in the Ottoman harem throughout the long history of humankind. There have always been places shrouded in dazzling splendor, yet when one looks closely, cracks of darkness seep beneath the gilded surface. The harem of the Ottoman Empire was precisely such a place. To many, the harem is imagined as a paradise of pleasure. Golden palaces, corridors lined with silk, hundreds of concubines of exquisite beauty, their eyes glimmering with seduction. It was believed to be the private sanctuary of the Sultan, where the most beautiful women from every corner of the empire were gathered to entertain, sing, dance, and surrender themselves to the mightiest ruler of the Islamic world. But behind that glittering facade lies a reality far more terrifying than any nightmare. The Ottoman harem was not merely a space of indulgence. It was a luxurious prison, a golden cage where thousands of women were confined, broken, and transformed into instruments of power and desire. Young girls, many no older than 13 or 14, were torn away from their homes in distant villages across the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. They were shackled, dragged into slave markets, and sold like livestock. Whether they had been princesses, noble daughters, or simple peasant girls mattered little. Once the iron gates of the harem closed behind them, they ceased to be daughters, sisters, or wives. They became nothing more than living objects, left to the mercy of fate. Within the harem, absolute power rested in the hands of the Sultan, a ruler both political sovereign and spiritual leader. With a single nod or frown, he could decide the destiny, status, and very soul of hundreds of women. One chosen glance could elevate a slave girl to a favored consort, perhaps even to the throne of valid sultan, the mother of a future heir. Yet one mistake, one fleeting lapse in charm, could cast her into oblivion, abandoned to rot in dark chambers, or worse, executed without a trace. Perhaps the most horrific of all was the forced training each girl endured. Upon entering the harem, they were stripped not only of freedom but of their very selves. They were taught how to walk gracefully, how to smile at the right moment, how to entertain the Sultan with songs and dances, and above all, how to wield their bodies as weapons of seduction. Their own flesh was no longer theirs. It became an instrument for survival. Outsiders often assumed that living in the harem was a privilege, but for the women trapped inside, it was nothing less than a life sentence in velvet chains. They could not leave. They could not love freely. They could not dream of a life beyond those jeweled walls. A single misplaced glance, a careless word, even a shadow of disobedience could bring about their death. History records chilling tales, sultans ordering concubines drowned in sacks and cast into the Bosphorus for mere suspicions of betrayal. Others demanded humiliating sexual performances to amuse themselves and their courtiers. In such a world, desire was inseparable from torment, and pleasure inseparable from cruelty. What makes the tragedy even deeper is that women in the harem were not only victims of the Sultan's will but pawns in a political game. A concubine who bore a son became a figure of immense influence, for her child might one day inherit the throne. Meanwhile, those unable to conceive were discarded, their lives reduced to shadows until death claimed them. Rivalries festered. Concubines poisoned one another, whispered slander, or schemed in the dark hall for the fleeting hope of catching the Sultan's eye. This was the cruel paradox of the Ottoman harem, a place where love was distorted, desire was weaponized, and women were nothing more than pieces on a chessboard of power. Today, when people recall the Ottoman Empire, they often speak of glorious conquests, magnificent architecture, and a civilization that spanned 3 continents. But few dare to look at the shadows. The harem, where countless tears were shed, unrecorded by history, As we embark on uncovering the most horrifying sexual secrets of the Ottoman harem, let us set aside the images of red silk curtains, dazzling feasts, and glittering mosaics. For behind every veil of beauty lies a golden prison, where desire, power, and cruelty intertwine to forge one of the darkest legacies of human history. And once that veil is lifted, one haunting question remains. Was the harem truly a paradise of pleasure, or was it, in truth, a hell veiled in luxury? The harem, a prison of desire in the imagination of many. The Ottoman harem has long been painted as a paradise of pleasure, a shimmering sanctuary, where the sultan was surrounded by music, dance, and the most beautiful women in the empire. Yet behind that seductive image lay a harsh and chilling truth. The harem was not a paradise, but a gilded prison, where women lived under constant surveillance, fear, and despair. Girls taken into the harem, the path into the harem was almost always paved with blood and tears. Few entered by choice. Most of the women came from conquered lands: Greece, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine, Armenia, North Africa, or Central Asia. During Ottoman campaigns, soldiers seized girls by the hundreds, tearing them from their families, shackling their wrists, and herding them into slave caravans. In the bustling slave markets of Istanbul, they were paraded like livestock. Their youth, beauty, and bodies determined their worth. The flawless complexion, striking eyes, or graceful posture could mean selection for the sultan's harem. Those deemed less appealing were sold off to nobles, merchants, or officials. Many of these captives were no older than 12 or 13, barely aware of what it meant to be a woman before being thrust into the world of forced servitude. Life inside the harem, once the heavy gates of the Topkapi Palace closed behind them, the girls lost more than their freedom. They lost their very selves. From that moment, they were no longer daughters or wives, no longer individuals with hopes or dreams. They became living possessions of the sultan. The harem itself was a city within a palace. New arrivals were placed in communal quarters under the watchful eyes of eunuchs, castrated men who served as guards, trainers, and informants. These eunuchs, stripped of manhood, were considered trustworthy to control the women. Yet their role was far darker. They acted as jailers, enforcers, and spies, ensuring no woman strayed from obedience. Life in the harem was a contradiction. On the surface, it seemed rich with luxury, silk garments, jeweled ornaments, and lavish feasts. But beneath this veneer was suffocating control. The women were forbidden to leave. They could not choose whom to love. They could not even dream of a world beyond the palace walls. Every smile, every word, every gesture had to be calculated, for a single misstep could lead to ruin. Training. The women, every slave girl, underwent a brutal process of training. They were taught languages, music, etiquette, and the art of dance, but above all, they were trained in the arts of seduction and submission. They learned how to walk with elegance, how to bow their heads in the right measure of humility, how to look into the sultan's eyes with both fear and devotion. Their bodies were honed as tools not for their own joy, but as instruments to satisfy the sultan's whims. Survival in the harem meant turning one's very flesh into currency. Those who excelled might be chosen to serve the sultan at feasts, then possibly in his private chambers. A woman who bore him a son could rise to astonishing power, perhaps even to the rank of valid sultan one day. Yet such fortune fell only upon a few. The vast majority of women aged and died within the walls of the harem, their lives fading like forgotten shadows. Death in silk and gold. To live in the harem was not to be safe, it was to live under the shadow of silent death. Punishment came swiftly and without warning. A careless glance, an ill-spoken word, or the simple loss of favor could seal a woman's fate. History whispers of concubines drowned in sacks and tossed into the Bosphorus, their bodies vanishing beneath the water so no blood would stain the palace. Others were strangled quietly, their deaths erased as though they had never existed. The next morning, music and laughter would resume, as if nothing had happened. The illusion of paradise from the outside, the harem appeared dazzling, a sanctuary of beauty, filled with music, perfumes, and glittering silks. But for those trapped within, it was nothing more than a silken cage, where every step was watched, every choice denied, and every dream suffocated. It was a place where women lived in constant contradiction, surrounded by splendor, yet stripped of dignity, adorned in jewels, yet enslaved by fear. To the world, it was a paradise. To those within, it was a prison of the body, of the mind, and of the soul. The cruel paradox of the Ottoman harem was thus revealed. A world where luxury masked despair, desire became a weapon, and women were reduced to pawns in the ruthless game of power. Sexuality as a weapon of power inside the Ottoman harem. Sexuality was never simply about fleshly pleasure. It was transformed into a weapon of control, a political instrument, and a means to secure absolute authority for the Sultan. The absolute power of the Sultan. Every night, the Sultan had the right to choose any woman within the harem to share his bed. What appeared to be a private indulgence was, in truth, an act heavy with political weight. A single glance, a single gesture of desire, could elevate one woman to the pinnacle of power or condemn another to obscurity and death. A concubine who pleased the Sultan repeatedly could become his favorite, showered with privileges beyond the reach of others. If she bore him a son, her status transformed entirely. Her child might one day inherit the throne, making her a figure of immense influence. In that moment, the body of a slave girl could become the vessel of dynastic survival. Yet for those who fell from favor, the descent was swift and merciless. They could be exiled within the palace, condemned to silent rooms where they withered away in isolation. Others were eliminated altogether, their bodies hidden, their names erased. The dominance of the valid sultan above all other women in the harem stood the valid sultan, the queen mother. Once a concubine herself, she gained unimaginable power when her son ascended to the throne. The valid sultan commanded the harem with an iron hand, dictating which women were allowed to approach the sultan and which were cast aside. Her influence reached far beyond the gilded walls. With access to her son's ear, she could shape imperial policy, forge alliances, or orchestrate the downfall of rivals. From the shadows of the harem, the valid sultan often wielded more influence than viziers and generals. Thus, a single night in the sultan's chambers could alter not only a woman's fate, but the direction of an entire empire. A battlefield among women, the harem was not merely a prison. It was also a battlefield. Women, stripped of freedom, were forced to compete for survival. Every smile at the sultan, every dance, every whispered word became a weapon. This rivalry often turned deadly. Some concubines resorted to poisoning, others to slander, and still others to secret plots to remove their competition. A single selection by the sultan. Each night was not simply a matter of intimacy, it was a silent war in which the prize was life itself. The chosen woman might bask in triumph, while others watched with envy, despair, or rage. Within those walls, sexuality ceased to be personal. It was a ticket to survival, a ladder to power, and a shield against oblivion. Nights of politics disguised as passion. The bed of the sultan was not only a place of pleasure, it was also a throne of influence. Some women, especially those of noble birth or from strategically important regions, whispered counsel into the sultan's ear during intimate moments. A sigh, a touch, A suggestion uttered in the darkness could sway decisions of war or peace, of life or death for entire provinces. This made the Sultan's private chambers a political arena, as significant as the imperial court. Behind closed doors, policies were shaped, alliances forged, and enemies condemned, all under the guise of passion. Desire turned into chains. The deepest tragedy of the harem was not merely physical imprisonment, but the corruption of human intimacy itself. Sexuality was stripped of its natural meaning. It was no longer an act of love or connection, but a performance demanded by fear, survival, and ambition. Every touch carried calculation. Every embrace carried risk. Affection was replaced by pretense, and tenderness by terror. The women wept not for broken hearts, but for the unbearable pressure of survival in a world where their very existence depended on the Sultan's fleeting desire. Tales of horror and domination, whispers of history, speak of sultans who demanded their concubines, performed degrading spectacles before courtiers as demonstrations of his absolute dominion. Others took perverse pleasure in watching women humiliated or punished, blurring the line between lust and cruelty. There are even tales of rulers who executed dozens of concubines in a single night, driven not by reason but by paranoia, by dreams of betrayal, or by the twisted ecstasy of power. These stories, whether chronicled in record or legend, reveal a chilling truth. In the harem, pleasure was never innocent. It was soaked in fear, tainted with blood, and inseparable from cruelty. The horrifying secrets at the outer image of the Ottoman harem dazzled the world with golden walls, silken curtains, and graceful dancers. The hidden truths within revealed something far darker. The harem was not simply a prison of desire, it was also the stage for the most horrifying sexual secrets ever concealed behind imperial walls. Perverse spectacles of pleasure. For the sultans, possessing absolute authority meant that even pleasure had to mirror their power. Ordinary intimacy was not enough. They demanded spectacles, bizarre and degrading performances in which women were forced to act like puppets in plays of lust. Concubines were ordered to dance half-naked before courtiers. Their humiliation, a spectacle meant to entertain the ruler and remind his audience of his dominion. On some nights, dozens of women were forced into orchestrated acts of collective intimacy, mere entertainment for the Sultan's gaze. Any woman who resisted paid a terrible price: beatings, starvation, or execution. Desire entwined with cruelty in the harem. The line between lust and torture often disappeared. Women were sometimes chained, degraded, or compelled into acts designed not for pleasure, but for submission. For some rulers, the true thrill lay not in love or intimacy, but in witnessing fear, in bending human dignity to the breaking point. Chroniclers whisper of sultans who had their eunuchs whip women before taking them to bed, reveling in the mingling of tears and flesh. Desire, in this world, was inseparable from cruelty. Pleasure was forged in the shadow of pain. Silent deaths in the shadows, but perhaps the most chilling of all were the deaths that left no trace, the silent deaths of women erased from existence. When concubines fell from favor, or even provoked the Sultan's suspicion, their fates were sealed in silence. The method was infamous. Women were tied in sacks and thrown into the dark waters of the Bosphorus, their bodies vanishing beneath the waves. No blood was shed within the palace, no stain on marble floors. By morning, music would rise once more, as if the vanished had never lived. To the empire, they were nameless. To history, they became nothing more than whispers carried by the wind. Women as bargaining chips. Not all concubines died within the harem. Some were given away as gifts to princes, viziers, generals, as rewards for loyalty, or to secure alliances. These women were traded like precious objects, their bodies transformed into currency in the economy of power. They were no longer daughters or lovers, but tools, tokens of favor, moved from hand to hand like treasures that could be owned, used, and discarded. Voices from the survivors. Most of the harem's secrets were buried with the women who endured them. Yet a handful of survivors left behind their testimonies, fragments of memory that haunt us still. They spoke of endless nights filled with tears, of the suffocating despair of confinement, of being stripped of every trace of choice. Some described the harem as a living tomb, where each day drained them of will until nothing remained but the body they were forced to surrender. Paradise or hell, the harem, celebrated by poets as a garden of beauty and desire, revealed its true face in these whispered accounts. It was not paradise, but a masquerade of cruelty beneath silks and jewels. The true horror was not only the physical suffering, but the way grandeur itself became the mask of oppression. From the outside, the harem gleamed with gold. Inside, it drowned in silence, fear, and despair. It was the cruelest illusion of all. A world that promised paradise but delivered hell. A world where pleasure was steeped in blood, luxury was built upon tears, and women were reduced to shadows beneath the weight of power. In popular imagination, the Ottoman harem has long been painted as a symbol of splendor, jeweled walls, silken veils, and a world of unending beauty. Yet when the veil is lifted, the illusion collapses. The harem was never a paradise of desire, it was a hell veiled in luxury. Behind every banquet and glittering hall lay the sorrow of countless women, reduced to slaves of lust and power. They were not divine goddesses, as the outside world believed, but human beings, daughters, sisters, wives torn from their lives and locked away in a golden prison, where their bodies and souls were no longer their own. Power built on flesh of the Ottoman Empire was built upon conquest and blood. Then the harem was sustained by flesh and desire. Each concubine was a pawn, every night of intimacy a political move, every child born a potential heir to the throne. Sexuality in the harem was never innocent. It became a ruthless instrument, used to reward, to punish, to elevate, or to destroy. In the Sultan's hands, desire was no longer a private act, but a force that dictated destiny, shaped dynasties, and silenced countless lives beneath the waters of the Bosphorus. Desire and the darkness of humanity. The harem forces us to confront something far more unsettling than political cruelty. The darkness of human desire itself. When lust is given unchecked power, it mutates into a weapon of domination. When authority is absolute, intimacy is stripped of love, reduced to submission and fear. What chills us is not only the stories of drowned women or humiliating spectacles. It is the realization that such acts were once considered ordinary within the heart of a great empire. What was accepted as normal then stands before us now as a monument of horror. Echoes in the present. Today, the palaces of Istanbul stand as museums, the harems empty and silent. Yet the questions they leave behind remain disturbingly relevant. How many harems still exist in our world, hidden in modern forms? How many women still live in cages without bars, trapped by the same cycle of exploitation, desire, and control? The Ottoman harem has crumbled, but the structures of oppression it embodied persist in new guises through trafficking, exploitation, and the commodification of bodies. The walls may be gone, but the shadow lingers. A cautionary tale, the story of the harem is not merely a dark chapter in history. It is a warning. It reminds us that when power and desire intertwine unchecked, humanity is stripped away. It shows us how splendor can mask cruelty, how beauty can disguise despair, and how silence can bury the voices of thousands. To remember the harem is not only to mourn its victims, but to remain vigilant, to ensure that such presence, whether built of stone or silence, are never allowed to rise again. The haunting legacy the harem once praised as a paradise of beauty was, in truth, a vast grave of forgotten lives. Its legacy is not one of luxury but of tears and shadows. No gold, no silk, no music could conceal the suffering it contained. And as night falls upon the memory of the empire, a single question echoes in the darkness. Have we truly escaped the shadows of the harems of the past, or do they still exist among us, hidden beneath new masks of power and desire?